You know the victory feast. Firelight flickering on carved beams, horn cups raised, the hall full of music and boasting. Warriors press close to the mead bench while the poets chant glory and the banners stir. Imagine then the same night after the torches gutter. Not just chests and cattle lashed to the longships, but people counted out and crated, mothers and daughters sorted and priced, their names already fading in the ink of chronicles that cared more for kings' tallies than for faces turned toward the sea. They weren't only taking treasure, they were taking people, and among them women of rank, skill, and consequence. The evidence is uneven. Terse annal entries, saga episodes that wrap memory and storytelling, and graves that speak in wood and bone. Taken together, these sources sketch a pattern that is more systematic than random, an economy of human cargo where noble women could become currency, bargaining chip, laborer, bride, or ritual attendant. What the sagas and the graves whisper together is darker than the victory songs alone. If this is gripping you, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Then stay with me. Each of the 7 cases that follow opens a different corner of that hidden world. To understand why women were taken, start with the basics. Viking raiding was not merely peripatetic violence. It was an economic system with logistics, markets, and legal categories. Norse law distinguished free people from thralls. A victorious party could claim captives as thralls or slaves under customary practice. Coastal strongholds and monastic sites were attacked because they concentrated wealth and people. Dublin and other port towns functioned as hubs where goods and human beings were exchanged. The sources repeatedly record captives being brought to market. Silver in these transactions was measured by weight, by ounces or by pounds of silver, not always by neat coinage. In that economy, rank and gender could be converted into measurable value. A noblewoman might command a higher price, offer political leverage in marriage exchanges, or be kept as a domestic specialist. The chronicles and legal texts do not always describe motive, and historians must be careful. When the annals state that many women were carried away, the phrasing is laconic but clear in its meaning. Number 1. The coastal fortress listed in an early annal entry about c. 821. A raid on a stronghold identified in some manuscripts as Etar or Arth. Place name reading uncertain. Verify source. The entry is terse. It notes a coastal place taken and many women carried away into captivity. Annals, entry c. 821. From that laconic line, scholars read a familiar pattern. A fortified coastal settlement assaulted, defenders overwhelmed or bought off, and captives shipped across the Atlantic to marketplaces like Dublin. Archaeology and contemporaneous commerce records show Dublin functioning as a regional auction point for people as well as goods. The market did not only trade menial labor. Legal and saga material shows that captured women could be integrated into households as concubines or domestic managers or sold onward into continental markets. The sources emphasize measurement, silver paid by weight, transactions recorded by ounce and pound. That detail is small but telling. It reduces a living person into a weight on a scale, tradable in an economy. These annal entries do not often name the women. They list the capture as a tally of spoils. That erasure, the conversion of identity into commodity, is the first shock. Noble status could be flattened into a price tag, and the historical voice that survives is the ledger, not the life. Number 2. Melkorka of the Laxdæla saga, a case where the human story is preserved in saga memory. The Laxdæla saga reports a woman described as the daughter of an Irish king, Melkorka, sold into slavery and taken to Iceland, where she lived in the household of an Icelander named Höskuld. She bore a son, Olaf the Peacock, who later rose to prominence and traced an Irish paternal line through his mother's reputed origins. The saga preserves this as both a domestic anecdote and a marker of cross-cultural ancestry. Melkorka's story is invaluable because it personalizes a general pattern: the captive who becomes a household figure, whose identity is partially hidden and yet whose blood reshapes future generations. Her name is preserved, but the saga perspective layers literary shaping over whatever kernel of historical truth exists. Still, the core fact the saga communicates is that women taken in raids could be sold and retained as concubines or servants, and that their offspring could be integrated into settler societies. It also demonstrates a painful paradox. While maternal lines could survive and even be celebrated in genealogies, the woman herself could remain in a subservient, often voiceless position. The Laxdæla saga offers a narrative reconstruction rather than a legal record, so its testimony must be weighed alongside other evidence, but it hardens the point that forced female migration had human and demographic consequences. Number 3. Coldingham and the Abbess recorded in the later 9th century, an episode the chronicles connect to raids on religious houses. Sources indicate that a community of nuns at Coldingham was attacked around 870. Later medieval chroniclers and monastic catalogues report extreme acts: self-mutilation by some women to ward off the threat of sexual violation, followed by the burning of the settlement and mass deaths. The account is exceptional in tone and content, and historians must treat the report cautiously. It mixes moral interpretation with reporting of violence. Nonetheless, it reveals the stakes for medieval women when religious sanctuary offered limited protection against raiders whose strategies included forced removal, sexual violence, and killing. The Coldingham Report, source type annal/monastic chronicle, exact manuscript traditions vary, demonstrates the moral crisis that such raids provoked in contemporaries. Chroniclers recorded not simply a loss of property, but a spiritual and bodily catastrophe that called for extraordinary reactions. The language of the sources is sometimes rhetorical, intended to shame or to exhort, and the precise actions attributed to the women, including self-inflicted wounds, are represented as responses within a moral economy where rape and forced concubinage were feared outcomes. Where the annals give this episode, they do so to register the terror such attacks and to cast the invaders not merely as fighters, but as agents of social rupture. Number 4. Canterbury, 1011, and the taking of hostages that ends in a stark arithmetic of life and liberty. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other contemporary sources recount the siege of Canterbury and the capture of leading clerical and civic figures, including Archbishop Elfeha, spelling uncertain in manuscripts, often rendered Elfeha or Elfeg. Captives were held and a ransom demanded. The narrative of Elfeha's imprisonment and eventual murder when payment was refused is one of the best documented medieval episodes that link hostage-taking with fiscal calculus. Chroniclers report that the invaders sought a payment measured in large amounts of silver. The exact sums recorded vary between manuscripts and later chroniclers, but the emphasis is consistent. Life could be exchanged for silver, and noble captives, clerics, abbesses, and women of standing could be held as bargaining chips. This case illuminates a grim reality. For some women, survival depended not on status per se, but on whether a party with means could negotiate a price. The arithmetic of ransom turns personhood into currency. The annalistic record may preserve names for a moment, but often only as items on an inventory of value. Number 5. Dumbarton Rock, the stronghold of Strathclyde, attacked and taken around 870. The annals describe a lengthy siege that ended in surrender. The king's family and many inhabitants were taken away. The siege, reported to endure months, culminated in the killing of the king and the transport of a large number of captives to Norse networks of trade and slavery. This episode is crucial because it demonstrates scale and logistical efficiency. A 4-month investment of ships, men, and supplies to take a fortress required planning. The captors did not simply disperse into the night with loot, but moved masses of people into existing systems of sale and labor. The annals make clear that royal families were not immune. Noble status might determine a captive's future as a bargaining chip or a high-value captive, yet it could not guarantee protection against slaving operations. The Dumbarton episode reveals an organized, almost industrial element to the taking of people in this period. Number 6. Iceland's founding, an instance where forced female migration left a durable biological trace. Landnama Book and other settlement-age sources attest that during the colonization of Iceland in the late 9th and 10th centuries, some of the women who arrived were taken from Ireland and Britain. Modern genetic research complements these textual hints. Mitochondrial DNA studies of Icelandic populations suggest that a substantial proportion of maternal lineages traced to Gaelic origins in Ireland and Western Scotland. Estimates vary between studies, but a commonly cited figure is that roughly 60% of the female ancestry in early Icelandic genealogies is of Irish/Scottish maternal origin. This is not proof of coercion on a one-to-one basis, but when read with sagas and annals that recount the taking and selling of people, the genetic pattern suggests that women's forced mobility was a significant factor in shaping the demography of a new polity. The shock here is demographic rather than anecdotal. The composition of a nation's maternal lines carries the imprint of violence and exchange across generations. Number 7. The Oseberg ship burial, dated by dendrochronology to 834 AD and excavated in the early 20th century, perhaps the most famous elite Scandinavian grave of the Viking Age. The cemetery mound contained a richly furnished ship holding the remains of 2 women, an older woman in an elite assemblage of textiles, wood carving, and domestic implements, and a younger attendant whose grave goods and biological indicators have invited intense study. Scientific analyses, isotopic readings that reflect childhood diet and movement, and mitochondrial DNA studies suggest the younger woman had a non-local signature when compared with North Scandinavian baselines. Archaeologists interpret these data cautiously. The isotopes are consistent with a childhood spent in a different geological and dietary setting, and the mtDNA indicates a different maternal lineage than the older woman. One plausible interpretation, advanced in scholarly literature with careful hedging, is that the younger woman may have been of foreign origin and joined the elite household as an attendant or captive whose role at death was to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. The Oseberg burial is a striking, material instance of how elite display could subsume other lives into a tableau. The 2 women are inseparable in the grave goods and in the narrative the site creates. But scientific analysis allows us to detect difference within that unity. The burial's grandeur, the ship measuring over 20 meters, and the richness of the goods, juxtaposed with the possible foreign origin of one attendant, speaks to both the status and the erasure inherent in such rites. Between these cases, several connected themes appear. First, the commodification of women was systemic enough to leave traces across textual genres and disciplines. The annals' dry tallies, the saga's human-scale stories, and the excavated grave assemblages agree that people were moved and repurposed in economic and political systems. Second, erasure of identity is a recurring feature. The record often preserves male names, the names of captors, or the names of places, while women's given names, unless notable in saga tradition, slip into anonymity. Third, gendered violence took many forms: enslavement, forced marriage, economic exploitation, and sometimes killing. And the sources register each in different registers: legal terms, pitying moral commentary, pragmatic account. The moral and human dimensions of these acts are not fully recoverable, yet convergence across disciplines, analytic notes, saga memory, isotope chemistry, and genetics allows historians to tell a more textured story than any single source permits. There are also important contrasts and limits to this pattern. The Ridgeway Hill mass grave in southern England, an executed warband discovered in recent decades, provides a grim counterpoint. Archaeology there revealed a group of male-bodied individuals executed and dumped in a pit, a different fate from the mobilities and survivals traced in the cases above. The Ridgeway Hill evidence shows that raiding and reprisals could end in execution rather than enslavement, and that outcomes varied by sex, status, and context. What the Ridgeway Hill story emphasizes is that gender shaped the form of violence and disposal. Men sometimes died on the battlefield or were executed. Women were more often transported and integrated into other social orders, whether as thralls, wives, or ritual attendants. Throughout, historiographical caution is required. Many of our most vivid statements derive from later compilations or from narrative sources written under different purposes than modern historiography. When the Laxdæla saga preserves Melkorka's tale, it blends memory, oral tradition, and literary artistry. When annals record women carried away, their terseness hides complexities of motive and circumstance. Archaeology gives us material facts, a ship, a bone chemistry signature, but the cultural meaning of those facts requires interpretive work. Any claim that a named woman was sold for a specific price, or that an attendant at Oseberg was definitely a captive, must be qualified. Isotopic evidence suggests origin. mtDNA indicates maternal relationships. Dendrochronology fixes dates, but none of these prove inner states or intentions. Where interpretation ventures beyond what the evidence can sustain, it should be framed as hypothesis. These data suggest, they may indicate, it is possible that. What then do we gain by knitting these fragments together? First, a reframing of Viking raiding as a system that targeted people as economic resources. This reframing does not deny heroism or trading networks. It situates raiding within a spectrum of behaviors that included organized slaving operations, markets where human beings were exchanged, and legal mechanisms that normalized thraldom. Second, a recovery of erased voices. Where the annals are silent or the sagas are selective, archaeology and genetics can supply lines of evidence that restore biography in a limited but meaningful way. Maternal ancestry, childhood movement, burial position, grave goods that imply role. Third, an ethical imperative for historians and audiences. To remember these women not as footnotes to male exploits, but as actors and victims whose fates mattered to the people around them and whose descendants carried their blood into new societies. Finally, what does responsible scholarship recommend? First, always cite source types. The Annals records. The Laxdæla saga reports. Dendrochronology dates the Oseberg burial to 834 AD. Isotopic analysis suggests a non-local childhood. Second, where manuscripts disagree or where names and dates are uncertain, flag that uncertainty. Some place names in early entries appear garbled in the transmission, e.g., Atar or Arth in certain manuscripts. Verify place name reading. Third, avoid sensationalism. Describe harm with restraint and focus on structural patterns rather than lurid detail. And fourth, keep interdisciplinary evidence in conversation. Text, bone chemistry, and genetic studies each have limits, but together they produce a more robust picture. Remembering these women is also a matter of public stewardship. Source compilations, accessible bibliographies, and careful translations help non-specialists engage responsibly. If you want to go deeper, check the description below for a reading list and links to primary source translations and archaeological reports. The past is noisy with lorry songs, but a different, quieter record survives in ledgers and graves, one that asks us to look and to reckon. This is not a tale of one-off outrages. It is an account of a system that could, in particular moments and places, treat noble women as human cargo, political leverage, and domestic labor. The shock is not in the single act, but in the pattern, and in the way long-term consequences, a nation's maternal lines, a burial's attendants placed and silenced, echo through centuries, We owe these women attention and clarity to distinguish what the sources assert, what the science suggests, and where our explanations remain conjectural. If this exploration sparked questions, please share this video and consult the source links in the description for the annals, sagas, and archaeological studies mentioned. Preserving and investigating these records is how we turn erasure back into memory.